I think you're on mute, Adrian.
I clicked the mute and then it still didn't work. It's the first time doing this this show here. Hey, delighted to be here with you. I'm Adrian Gostick, unmuted now. That's Chester Eldon. Well, it waved to everybody, Chess. And we are delighted to join you today. Not only are we Thrive Together global community, but everybody joining in on the worldwide interweb. All around the world. And we're going to talk today about the Great Resignation and perhaps the Great Reassessment that's going on, right, Chess?
Yeah, it is really interesting. There is a lot of talk about the Great Resignation. And of course, you wrote a brilliant article in Forbes.
Okay.
It's always better to have somebody else brag about, yeah, I know it's brilliant. In fact, in the chat box, we've got a link to that article on 5 ways to deal with that Great Resignation. Before we jump into that, though, I really do think part of the resignation is a reevaluation. People are really trying to figure out, why do I want to keep doing what I'm doing if there's something better out there? And you talked a little bit about that in the preamble to your 5 solutions. So why don't you expound on that a little bit, Adrian?
Great. And Natalie will share the link to the article. And by the way, if you're joining us today from anywhere in the world, type in where you're joining us from, and we'd love to connect here. What really kind of sparked it for me, we've been hearing about this Great Resignation, 4 million workers missing in the U.S. alone that have not come back after the pandemic. What we're finding is it becomes very personal and affects us, right? My little town near Park City, Utah here, went to the local cafe and it was closed. Talked to the owner and he said, not like a customers, we got all the business we could use. He says, I just cannot find workers. And that it becomes very personal when it affects us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is how many people just decided to retire? That they'd kind of had enough and they liked being home with their families. They didn't enjoy the stress and anxiety of work. And what was the number? It was ridiculous. It was like 43 years old or something. Yeah. People were actually deciding to just pack it in and leave, which is about the average age of the American workforce. So what were your 5 tips? I know what they are, but share them with the viewers here. Some tips on how to maybe convince people that, working isn't all that bad.
Right. So if you're a leader watching this, or if you're one of the people who is assessing where you are right now, hopefully this will be a little helpful because it is around career. What we've figured out from the pandemic, first and foremost, is that many people found, this working from home thing, it's not that bad. The way they had been doing things wasn't perhaps that great before. One man described his job to us this way. He says, I hauled my sorry carcass out of bed every morning, trudged off to a job, did work I didn't get credit for, got in trouble for things I didn't do, tried my hardest to keep everything afloat, then returned home the next day to start the process all over again.
A dream job.
Absolutely. But how many of us did that? And the thing is, we are driven as human beings to find meaning in our lives. And there wasn't much meaningful about that description, was there? So what we're finding now, Chester and I, we do a lot of consulting with large organizations. We also do a lot of executive coaching. What we found is that if you want one simple thing to help with this process, the Great Resignation, focus on people's careers. Do more, not less. Gen Zs and millennials, one recent Gallup poll found 9 out of 10 highly valued development opportunities, but only 4 out of 10 say they've learned anything new in the last 30 days. That's a huge disconnect, isn't it, Chess?
Yeah, it is interesting, this idea of I'm progressing, that I'm learning and growing. We put together our Motivators Assessment years ago, and we've had just under 100,000 people take it. And this idea of learning and growing. And, I guess I'm not that surprised that the younger generations or the new generations of workers want more feedback and want more opportunity. The pace of life is just so much faster now.
Yeah.
You play video games, you get 300 positive affirmations in a minute. and then we tell you in the workplace, the old English stuff. Well, if you're an apprentice for 20 years, then you might, nobody's got that kind of patience anymore. So you had a great example of a company that kind of figured that out.
Yeah, because this is the first step we found in helping people with their careers and bringing them back from this Great Resignation is simply create more steps to grow. Mark Sandella, who is the CEO of a company called Ladders, it's a career site. What he did was, well, first off, he says, when I joined, my first company as a programmer, it took you 3 years to become a senior programmer, and then you could become a systems architect, et cetera. But there were steps, and everything was 2 to 3 years. Well, he says, my Gen Zs, my millennials who joined, he says, they just didn't have that kind of patience, so they'd leave. He says, what did I try and do as a boss? I tried to tell them how good our system was and how they needed to work into it. And he says, eventually I realized I was fighting an uphill battle. I wasn't going to win that. So he says, I decided to change. So instead of it's 2 years or 3 years for a promotion, he says, now I'm putting in place 6 promotions over 2 years. So you start as a junior analyst, you then move to an analyst, you move to a senior. And he says, and I also put in little pay increases, little jumps in responsibility, but they also had to pass these little tests to make sure that they had the skills to move on. And he says, I thought they'd kind of think it was kind of silly, these things, but no, everybody took it really seriously. They'd send pictures to their moms and dads and high fives around the office. And he says, at the end of 2 years, it was still the same pay that they would have gotten before. But he says, I had a more engaged workforce. I had a more excited, team members who were really thrilled about what they were learning and growing in.
Yeah, it's just I want to know that I'm making progress, right?
Yeah.
So often I think in the workplace, we feel like we're treading water, and that's never fun. You want to think that there's a little more road behind you and a little more opportunity ahead. Well, great. Well, give us number 2, because we're only here for 15 minutes. So pick up the pace, Adrian.
Secondly, you got to coach the people in your care. If you want them to lessen their anxiety, to stay more connected to you, talk about the things that you can do as a leader to help them and have them think about where they're going. We spend all of our time as employees typically worrying about what our boss wants, right? Well, that's fine, but that doesn't get us to the next job, and thus we increase anxiety. So do a reality check with your people. Ask them how much of your day is spent thinking about, current tasks. How much of your week, though, is spent thinking about your future? It could just be an hour. That hour can be really powerful in helping you. So we've got to coach our people more than ever before, not to just think about what they're doing right now, but where they could go.
And I think that title of coach is really important. It's interesting in our careers early on, if an executive got a coach, it was sort of the last ditch effort to save his or her career. Yeah. Now it really is an investment, and people want to be coached up. I mean, think about if we were in our early 20s, if we'd had a guide or a coach, how helpful that would have been. By the way, in the chat box is the link to the Forbes article, and you can actually click on it and they'll read it to you. It's an 8-minute listen. It's not Adrian, and they do introduce you as Adrian Gostick, by the way.
Yeah, it's a robot. I mean, robots. They're going to take over the world one day. The nice thing is they'll be coming looking for Adrian Gostick, so they won't find
They're going to miss you, yeah.
Yeah.
Number 3.
I want to ask you about number 3, because this is something you and I worked on. This is, if you want your people to come back, be more engaged, you got to get them motivated, right? So talk a little bit about this idea of job sculpting.
Yeah, it is really interesting. We found that we were interviewing some fairly senior executives. This is when we self-published our book, What Motivates Me. And they were incredibly accomplished and yet incredibly unhappy. They were doing what they were really good at, not necessarily what they were passionate about. And so we brought in this idea of job sculpting, where we could say, well, are there some things that you could maybe delegate? Are there some things that maybe you would like to bring onto your plate, things that you're kind of passionate about that may not be exactly in your job description, but could be? And then, realizing that there's certain things that everybody has to do at some point. At some point, somebody has to take out the trash, right? Yeah. And it was really interesting how sometimes just these little tweaks could make such a huge difference. You remember the bank that we studied, where the average performer, his boss said, what are you really passionate about? And it was public speaking.
Yeah.
And she said, well, we never have anybody that wants to go to the job, the job fair at the local college. And he went and he got to speak, depending where you come from. And it was interesting. She said, not only did he enjoy doing that, his engagement level went up and his overall performance went up. Yeah. So really interesting. And of course, we developed a really cool Motivators Assessment. And
right.
What do we have?
So Natalie, why don't you bring that up if you don't mind? Chester and I, we worked for a couple of years with Gene Greaves and Travis Bradbury, clinical psychologists, to build the Motivators Assessment, the most scientifically developed way to assess really what you're motivated or your people are motivated by in their work. So if you take a screenshot of this really quickly, oh, there you go. Chess is doing
just with your camera. Oh, look, there it is.
Your camera, and it will link you to a free version of this assessment. It's the it'll give you a couple of top motivators, your bottom motivator, and your top identity. Now, from all this work with these clinical psychologists, we identified 23 human motivators. The chances of you and I having the same top 5 of those 23 in common is more than 1,000,000 to 1. We're all very different. And the trouble is trying to motivate our people. We think, well, I'll motivate them in the way that I would like to be motivated. That often doesn't work. So what I want you to do is take this assessment. It takes about 15 minutes or so. And then, maybe give it to some of your folks as well. Start understanding really what they're motivated by, right, Jess?
Well, yeah. And once you know where people's passions are, you can put them in a job where they can really thrive. You talk about the Great Resignation. Well, if I'm really enjoying my work, if I really feel motivated, if I feel like my manager is really investing in me, I'm much more likely to stay than I am to leave. It's pretty simple math, isn't it?
Yeah. And the last point here is, as we kind of look at our time, is that if you want to get your people engaged, bring them back from the Great Reassessment, is focus their development on what they want to develop at. Sometimes there's this strengths movement in the world, which is good. We all like to use our strengths, but sometimes our strengths sort of handcuff us. Teresa, she's so good at details. She's always our detail person on assignment. She's working behind the scenes, getting those details in. Well, maybe Teresa wants to be more creative or work with clients. No. She's our detail person, right? We've got to really focus our ideas and our development on the person. Now, you had a chance once to chat with Dan Helfrich, who's the CEO of Deloitte, one of the world's biggest companies, right? Can you help us understand what he says when he's developing people?
Yeah, he really takes an interest in all his people, and he asks them, where do you want to be 2 to 3 years from now? How can I help you get there? What are you working on? How can I help? I mean, he takes a deep dive to really understand, where do people find joy in work? Where do they really feel fulfilled? As I recall, one of the questions he asks is, well, what's the best part of your job? What really gets you engaged and excited? And conversely, what are the parts of the job that you really help?
I already asked too, what do you want to get better at?
Right.
I thought that was interesting, right?
What do you want to get better at? And how can I help?
Yeah.
Which I think is a great question. Again, that co-create, being a partner in what you're doing. So all these are great ideas. I'll tell you, more than anything, I think when employees feel like their voice is heard, that my opinion matters, that my boss, my supervisor, my manager, whoever that might be, has taken an interest in me as a person. I'll never forget when we were presenting to a consulting firm, and they asked the employees, what do you expect from your leader? Yeah. And the most poignant answer was, I don't want my leader to just make me a more efficient worker. I want my leader to help me become a better person. And I think those really are words to live by. If you're wanting to bring people in and keep them. Now, with the minute we've got left, Adrian, I want you to explain how important culture is when you hit hard times and how that brings you through. Because we've seen that, boy, if you've got a great culture to begin with, your odds are a lot better at getting through hard times, aren't they?
And this is not just corporate culture. You and your team can have a culture. If you are an employee, you can help build a culture within your work group. What we find is this is the time when we have to turn back to culture, to really focus in on who we are, why do we do what we do, where are we heading, and how are we going to get there? They're really simple questions I need to know as an employee. Who are we? That's our mission. Where are we going? That's our vision. How do we get there? That's our values. How do we behave together? You want to turn around what's become the Great Resignation, get your people involved in something meaningful. And that's what we do. No matter what we do in our organizations, help people feel like they're making a difference in this world.
Yeah. Well, my name is Chester Elton. I'm co-author with the lovely and talented Adrian Gostick and his son, Anthony Gostick, of Anxiety at Work. We also have a wonderful podcast. The link is in the chat box there. Please join us. We bring in some amazing guests that talk about their journey through anxiety. So if you want to avoid the Great Resignation or the Great Reevaluation, whatever you want to call it, click on that link, read the article that Adrian wrote for Forbes. It really is brilliant. tips on how to create just a great place to work where people feel valued, they feel like their voices are heard, engagement is high, anxiety is low, and you just might have a little fun along the way. Right, Adrian?
That's right. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next time.
See ya.